I'm 77 years old, and I finally see why I always felt empty. People hear my age and assume the emptiness came later, from loss, from time. But if I'm honest, it was already there long before life ever gave me a reason to explain it. I used to think emptiness was just part of who I was, a flaw, something subtle but permanent. I didn't talk about it much. It wasn't dramatic enough to explain, and it wasn't visible enough for anyone to notice. From the outside, my life looked full. A husband, a home that stayed standing, years that moved forward in the right order. But inside, there was always this quiet space that nothing seemed to reach. I told myself I was just practical, not emotional, not someone who needed a lot. That explanation worked for a long time. I married a man who was steady, kind in a way that didn't draw attention to itself. He didn't make promises out loud, but he kept showing up. When people talked about love, they talked about passion, about excitement, about intensity. What we had was quieter than that. I used to think quiet meant safe. I didn't realize it could also mean untouched. We built a life around routines that worked. We didn't waste energy on unnecessary conflict. We handled things as they came. I thought that meant we were doing it right. If I'm honest, I didn't expect marriage to fill me. I expected it to function, and it did. We raised children. We paid for what needed paying. We showed up to events we were supposed to attend. I wasn't unhappy. That's important to say. But I wasn't full either. There were moments when I felt something pressing from the inside. Not sadness, more like a question I didn't know how to phrase. Do you know that feeling? When something asks for your attention, but you don't have the language for it yet? I ignored it. I told myself that longing was for people who didn't have responsibilities, that wanting more meant being ungrateful for what you already had. So I stayed busy. Busy is very good at covering emptiness. It gives you a schedule. It gives you proof that you're useful. I became good at being needed, as a wife, as a mother, as someone who handled things. If something needed organizing, I did it. If something needed remembering, I remembered it. People relied on me, and that reliance gave me shape. But it didn't give me depth. I didn't notice how much of myself was built around being useful instead of being present. My husband didn't demand much from me emotionally. That made things easier. He wasn't distant, but he wasn't curious either. We didn't ask each other the kinds of questions that slow you down. We talked about what was next, what needed attention. I thought that was maturity. Looking back, I can see how often I chose steadiness over intimacy. Not because I didn't care, because intimacy felt like a risk I didn't know how to take. I loved him, that's true. And it's also true that I didn't always know how to be fully there while I was being good. Then he got sick. Cancer doesn't arrive with drama at first. It arrives quietly, through appointments, through words that don't feel real yet. Cancer doesn't only take a body, it takes the calendar first. You start living in next scan, next result, next week, and you don't notice you're shrinking your whole life down to waiting. At the beginning, I went into the role I knew best. I handled things. I tracked medications. I learned schedules. I spoke to doctors without letting my voice shake. People told me I was strong. I believed them. Strength gave me something to stand on when everything else felt uncertain. As the illness progressed, our world narrowed. Not suddenly, gradually. I became his caregiver. And caregiving has a strange effect on intimacy. It brings you physically closer, but it can keep you emotionally guarded. I focused on what needed doing, what could be managed, what could be controlled. There were moments when he tried to talk about what was happening to him, not medically, emotionally. I listened, but I stayed careful. I didn't want to open doors I couldn't close. I didn't want to fall apart when things still needed handling. So I stayed composed. I told myself I was protecting both of us. Looking back, I can see how often protection became avoidance. When he died, it wasn't sudden, but it was final in a way nothing prepares you for. People think grief arrives loudly. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it arrives as a hollowing out, a quiet removal of weight you didn't realize you were leaning on. After the funeral, after the phone calls slowed, after people returned to their lives, something strange happened. I had time. And with that time came a feeling I couldn't ignore anymore. I expected grief. I expected sadness. What surprised me was recognition. The emptiness didn't start then. It became visible then. Without the roles I had built myself around, there was nothing left to distract me from it. I began to understand that the emptiness I felt after his death wasn't new. It was familiar. I had lived with it for years. I just hadn't had a name for it. Losing him didn't create it. It revealed it. Grief was loud. The emptiness was quieter. And the quiet one was the older one. That realization was uncomfortable. It meant I couldn't blame circumstance, or time, or even loss. I started noticing patterns I had never questioned. How often I deferred my own feelings. How quickly I turned toward responsibility when something felt uncertain inside me. I realized I had spent my life being composed instead of being open. I had learned early that stability was the safest thing a woman could offer. Not curiosity, not desire, stability. So I built myself around that. I don't blame my husband. He lived inside the same assumptions. We did what we were taught. But after he was gone, I had to face a truth that didn't care about good intentions. I had spent decades being useful instead of being known. That's not something you notice when life is loud. You notice it when it gets quiet. There were days when I caught myself thinking, is this all there is now? Not because I wanted something dramatic, because I wanted something real. I realized that emptiness isn't the absence of people. It's the absence of engagement with yourself. I had always been present for others. I wasn't always present for myself. That's a hard thing to admit at 77. Because it means the feeling I thought would disappear with time didn't. It waited. And now, with fewer distractions, it finally had my attention. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it with clarity. If you had asked me years ago whether I felt fulfilled, I would have hesitated. Then I would have said yes, not because it was true, because it was easier than asking what fulfillment actually felt like. I see now that emptiness doesn't always come from loss. Sometimes it comes from a life spent not listening closely enough, to your own questions, to your own unease. I had assumed those feelings would resolve themselves if I kept doing the right things. They didn't. They waited. And now, at 77, I finally understand what I was missing. Not excitement, not validation, permission. Permission to feel without immediately managing it. Permission to want without justifying it. That understanding didn't come early, but it came honestly. And once it arrived, it refused to leave. I don't have the illusion that understanding fixes everything. It doesn't. What it does is change how you sit with yourself. After my husband died, there were long afternoons where nothing asked anything of me. No one needed organizing. No one needed managing. That absence felt strange at first, almost suspicious. I had spent so many years being necessary that not being needed felt like a kind of failure I couldn't name. At first, I filled that space the way I always had: errands, small tasks, things that created movement without meaning, motion without direction. But eventually, even that stopped working. I would sit down and feel that familiar hollow stretch inside me. And this time, I didn't rush to cover it. That was new. For the first time, I stayed still long enough to feel what I had always stepped around. I started noticing how uncomfortable I was with stillness. Not boredom, exposure. Without roles, without usefulness, I didn't know how to relate to myself. That realization didn't come gently. It arrived with resistance. That's when the emptiness changed shape. It stopped feeling vague. It became specific. It felt like years of unanswered internal questions finally lining up. Not loudly, patiently. I realized I had spent my life responding outward, to needs, to expectations, to circumstances, very rarely inward. At the time, that had felt responsible, even admirable. Now I can see it for what it was: avoidance dressed up as maturity. I began remembering small moments from my marriage that I had never paid attention to before. Not arguments, not mistakes, pauses. Times when my husband asked, "What do you want?" And I answered with something practical: dinner, plans, logistics. I didn't think I was avoiding the question. I thought I was being efficient. But efficiency isn't intimacy. Not because I didn't have an answer, because I hadn't learned how to listen for it. I had trained myself not to ask that question seriously. Wanting felt indulgent, dangerous, unnecessary, especially for a woman. We're taught early that fulfillment is something you earn through service, through sacrifice, through holding things together. So I did. And I did it well enough that no one questioned it, including me. After he was gone, friends encouraged me to stay busy, to find hobbies, to volunteer. They meant well. But I wasn't missing activity. I was missing contact with myself. That distinction mattered more than anything else. I started taking walks without a destination, no checklist, no purpose, just walking until something surfaced. At first, it was restlessness, then irritation, then sadness. Not grief exactly, something older, something that had been waiting. I realized I had been emotionally disciplined my whole life. I had learned how to keep feelings contained. Containment looks like strength until it becomes isolation. That's the part no one warns you about. I began asking myself questions I had avoided for decades. What do I actually enjoy when no one is watching? What do I feel drawn toward without needing to justify it? What parts of me never got exercised because they weren't useful? Those questions didn't come with answers right away. They came with silence. But it was a different kind of silence than before. It wasn't empty. It was attentive, waiting. I noticed how often I had confused peace with numbness, how often I had mistaken calm for connection. My marriage wasn't unhappy. That matters. But it also wasn't deeply examined. We moved alongside each other more than toward each other. That doesn't make us failures. It makes us products of what we were taught. Still, the cost shows up later. I feel it now in conversations that stay on the surface, in relationships where I don't quite know how to step forward emotionally. Awareness doesn't undo habits overnight, but it does interrupt them. And interruption is sometimes the most you get. At 77, I don't expect transformation in the dramatic sense. I expect honesty. There are things I can no longer fix, questions I can no longer ask the person I shared my life with. That's the part that hurts quietly. Not regret in the sharp sense, recognition, understanding without repair. I finally see that emptiness wasn't something missing from my life. It was something missing from my relationship with myself. I had lived outwardly, responsibly, consistently, but not always inwardly. I don't know how many years I have left. I don't frame it that way. What I know is that I no longer rush to fill silence just to prove I'm useful. I let it exist. I listen to what it carries. Sometimes it's loneliness, sometimes curiosity, sometimes a feeling I can't name yet. That's okay. I spent too long believing that clarity had to come first. Now I understand that presence does. If you're listening to this and you feel that same quiet emptiness, I won't tell you it means something is wrong with you. It might mean something in you hasn't been listened to yet, not fixed, not improved, heard. I can't go back and change how I loved or how I showed up, but I can stop running from myself now. And that, surprisingly, feels fuller than anything I've known.